Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Jonathan Sarna. I'm University Professor and the Joseph H. and Bellar Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University and Director of its Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you. This afternoon, I want to talk about a little known American chapter in the very long history of matzah. Um, Many listening are preparing to spend 8 days eating matzah. And I want to talk about the role of the Manischewitz company in transforming the process of matzah making and the character of matzah, and how this happened and how such a big change from the traditional way of making matzah, which was by hand, to machine-made matzah, even was legitimated. Um, Really, by looking at the transformation of matzah, we'll learn a lot about the transformation that Jews underwent over the past century and a half. Now, matzah is perhaps the original Jewish food. It's described in the Bible. How to make matzah is very carefully regulated by the rabbis. There are certain local customs, and the whole process has been refined through the centuries. And most places where you see handmade matzah described, you see it described in terms of a series of sequential steps, one after another, that have to be completed within 18 minutes. And matzah making was also characterized by a rather careful division of labor that is really still found in handmade shmura matzah. Shmura matzah, watched handmade matzah that is made in special bakeries today. So if you go to a shmura handmade matzah factory, you'll see one person measuring the flour, another pours water into the batter. Then there's a multi-stage process of kneading and rolling, and in many places that was actually performed by women. And then the dough is scored or perforated, um, so that the air can escape and it won't rise. And then it's placed on a rolling pin or a long pole and uh, put into a very hot oven and then sent off to be packed. Um, and then everything is carefully sanded and wiped and cleaned, and usually the paper on the tables is changed. You wash your hands and you start the process all over again. Um, the process, as I said, was somewhat gendered. Poor women, often widows and orphans, and you'll see that's important. They did the kneading, and this gave them a parnosa, as Jews would say. It gave them work during several months prior to Passover while this matzah is being baked. And then the other half of the labor was done by strong men who did the baking and lifting. Now, wherever you find multi-step processes like that, um, in the 19th century, with the rise of what we call industrialization, we see processes like that becoming mechanized. Someone had the idea that at least part of the job, or maybe the whole job, could be done by a machine. This is the Industrial Revolution. Reputedly, the first mechanical matzah machine was invented by a man named Isaac Singer in Alsace in 1838. It actually covered only one part of the process, the critical and actually very labor-intensive kneading of the dough. The machine, and there were various variants, won approval from some rabbis, and it quickly spread, shortening the process of matzah baking. It took less time, it required fewer people, it wasn't as expensive, but at the same time, this deprived lots of poor women of their meager livelihoods prior to Passover. Uh, it's worth remembering that technology has a good part and a bad part, and we see that in matzah as well. The matzah machine greatly increased the supply of matzah because the machine did all the kneading and it allowed for much more matzah to be produced. That was absolutely critical in the 19th century because the world Jewish population increased enormously in the 19th century. Thank God, many more children lived. Many people, if they do genealogy, will see their great grandparents were one of nine, and maybe the previous generation one of nine, and many of them lived, and therefore the population grew. So having a machine to make matzah helped a lot, and indeed, because matzah was produced now by machine, the price of matzah went down. Fewer hands were needed to produce it. Even today, machine-made matzah is much, much cheaper than handmade shmura matzah. And that led to a very interesting moral question that's worth thinking about. Is it better to reduce the price of matzah for everyone by introducing a machine, or is it better to protect the poor by keeping the machine out? Very difficult moral question. In 1858, someone asked Reb Shlomo Kluger of Brody, Brody in Austria. Rav Kluger was one of the leading rabbis and left us many answers to responsa. They asked Rav Kluger whether machine-made matzah is acceptable. Is it really kosher? And he wrote a long responsum, a long tshuva published in Moda'ah LeBeit Yisrael, an announcement to the House of Israel, that in his view, machine-made matzah was not kosher. And he made 4 claims against machine-made matzah that really helped to define the subsequent debate. First of all, he argued on the basis of Jewish law, on the basis of halacha, that the mitzvah of baking matzah, we make a blessing, l'shem matzot mitzvah, for the sake of the mitzvah of baking matzah, that requires, he argued, human exertion and intent. You've got to have intent that you're making matzah for Passover. How, he said, can a machine have any intent at all? Then he made a technical claim that the matzah is not reliable in preventing chametz, in preventing leaven from entering the process. Number three, and maybe most interesting, he made a social justice argument. He said the matzah machine deprives poor people of the meager living that they made from baking matzah. The late Professor Shlomo Shilo told me that Rav Kluger came himself from a poor family. He was sympathetic to the needs of the poor. He felt the matzah machine would drive the poor out of the matzah business, deprive them of the money they had historically received before Passover. He didn't think it was a good idea. And finally, he expresses an emotional fear that the matzah machine was like so many other innovations in matters of religious tradition. He worried that in time the machine would become an instrument of modernity, leading inevitably to assimilation, to apostasy, and so on. Naturally, those who disagreed with him made fun of that argument. It seemed to them ridiculous to say, eat machine-made matzah today, intermarry tomorrow. But one can understand why he was worried. Who knows where innovation and change will lead? Rav Kluger, however, was not the last word on the subject or the only view put forward. Indeed, every one of those four claims that he made was soon answered in a tshuva, a responsum, by a no less famous rabbinic decisor, a no less famous posek, whose name was Rav Yosef Shaul Nathanson of Lemberg. Actually, they were brothers-in-law. And Rav Nathanson went so far as to call his volume not Moda'ah, but Bitul Moda'ah, annulling the announcement. He argued in his responsum that machine-made matzah is preferable. It's cleaner. It's actually, in his view, more kosher than the handmade stuff. Naturally, with two very long and distinguished responsa, there was a great deal of debate. What's interesting when you really look on the ground at what happened historically, you find that machine-made matzah was much more successful in newer communities, say in the New World, in Western Europe, in the land of Israel, where so many had begun to move. And it was most resisted in old established communities, in Galicia, among Hasidic Jews. Chabad, for example, insisted on the use of traditional handmade matzah. Western, Central European Jews, New World Jews, even Lithuanian Jews, and as I said, immigrants to the land of Israel, they were more willing to accept the innovative kind of matzah by Rav Nathanson's responsum rather than Rav Kluger. Now, let's look more narrowly at the United States, where we see that the matzah machine arrives not so long after it's invented. We already see it described in America in about 1850. And within half a century, which is nothing in Jewish history, 50 years, the whole process of machine-made matzah was improved, and we see that machine-made matzah capturing the market. So how did it happen so quickly? And the interesting thing is, it happened with much less debate than was the case in Europe. And let's find out why. It has everything to do with a very significant figure named Ber Manischewitz. Ber Manischewitz was a uh, Lithuanian Jew. Um, we're told that he'd been close to the court of the great Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and then he emigrated to America. Different reasons are given why he decided to emigrate. He arrived in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1886. He worked for a while as a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, but then he moved into the matzah business, and it's easy to understand why that was a good business. Demand for matzah was very rapidly growing because the American Jewish population was multiplying owing to emigration. Thousands of Jews were immigrating to America every year. They they needed matzah for Passover. Now, of course, matzah had been made for a long time in America, but the standards were low. If you read 19th century newspapers, you hear various scandals and accusations. How careful are they making the matzah? Have they been baking it in a factory that made leavened product, and maybe they haven't cleaned the factory appropriately? Who's overseeing the matzah? And so on. The East European Jews who had immigrated were thrilled to have a man like Ber Manischewitz, who had a very great reputation for piety. When he said it was kosher, they believed him. He attracted a clientele. But Ber Manischewitz was more than just a pious and learned rabbi. He was a man who was deeply interested in technology. He loved innovative machines. He enjoyed tinkering. And what we see him doing is yoking modern technology to the service of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism, and introducing a whole series of new processes into matzah baking, some of which he invented, some of which he borrowed from others and put to use as never had been done before into matzah baking. And we see him by early in the 20th century, said by about 1903, he's using three different machines as part of the matzah making process, a huge advance over that original machine of Singer that we discussed. Yes, one was a kneading machine, but then he had another machine that rolled the dough and another that stretched the dough and perforated it and cut it. So he could now do many more processes by machine, and he set up an electric fan to keep the premises very cool, which was important, so there shouldn't be any fermentation that would enter the process. And eventually, it keeps improving and improving his factory. He creates a gas-fired matzah baking oven that allowed for better, more even distribution and control of heat, and with it, an enormously important and patented traveling carrier bake oven, which really was a kind of conveyor belt system that made it possible to automate the whole process of matzah baking. In other words, you put the dough on one end, and it slowly moved through a series of chambers, emerging as evenly baked, identically shaped matzah on the other end. And after Bear unfortunately passed away at a relatively young age in 1914, his son, um, Jacob Uriah, um, Yaakov really has about 50 patents um, in the matzah industry, including an electric eye, which counts the number of matzahs in a box, and packaging innovations. And finally, this was the summa, as far as the Manishewitzes were concerned. They built a matzah machine in 1920 that could produce 1.25 million matzahs every single day. Reputedly, it was the largest and most expensive single piece of machinery in any bakery in the whole world. It allowed Manischewitz to dominate the matzah field, given its ability to produce all of this. It could produce more matzah more cheaply, with much less breakage, and with a much more regular and pleasing appearance than had ever before been possible in all of Jewish history. Indeed, Manischewitz wrought a kind of revolution in the matzah business, characterized by three major transformations. First of all, before matzah, and you may know this from shmura matzah today, before matzah had been round or irregular or oval shaped. But now, owing to the demands of the technology and packaging, the matzah was square, in the same way that early cookies, also made on conveyor belt system, were square, think graham crackers. So all the matzah is square. That allows it to be properly and easily cut, and uh, it the technology forces a change in the shape. Second, where before each matzah was unique and distinctive in terms of shape, texture, overall appearance, no two were the same. Just open a box of handmade shmura matzah to this day, and no two matzahs are likely to be identical. But the Manischewitz machine-made matzah, the whole point that was that every matzah in the box came out looking and feeling and tasting the very same way. In other words, matzah underwent the same process of rationalization, standardization, mechanization that we associate with the management revolution, as it's known, of the late 19th, early 20th century. Manischewitz matzah, in other words, became a distinctive brand of matzah with all that that implied. And a brand meant every matzah was the same. You knew how that matzah would taste. And finally, where before matzah was a quintessentially local product, it was produced on an as needed basis in every Jewish community, and most matzah historically was not shipped very far because you were afraid of breakage. Indeed, people would come often and pick it up. Um, but that's not the case with Manischewitz. It now became a national brand, even an international product. Um, uh, they were making so much they could ship it wherever they wanted. And because every matzah was the same, it was much stronger. They fit together tightly in a box. The danger of breakage was much less. And it could be sold as a brand, just like soap and cereal were sold as brands. And in time, along with other brands that you were smaller, Hurwitz, Margaret, and Goodman, Streitz, but in time, Manischewitz would try and take maximum advantage of its ability to mass produce matzah, and actually it would drive out of business any number of local matzah bakers who simply could no longer compete with the lower price, with the volume, with the kind of product that Manischewitz produced. It drove them out of business. And in a way, Manischewitz did to Matzo what Procter and Gamble was doing, another Cincinnati firm, to soap and detergent. It drove out local production. It created national and international brands at a much lower price. Now, the question is, how did Manischewitz manage to persuade people to take their matzah? It looked so different than the handmade shmura matzah that Jews had so long associated with Pesach. How does this kind of innovation really win rabbinic sanction? And how is it accepted by people at large? In other words, how did Manischewitz overcome two great big challenges? Challenge number one is popular resistance to changing a long familiar product connected, that's a ritual product connected with Pesach. We say in the Haggadah, hold up the matzah, this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Well, how can you do that when you have a kind of newfangled square matzah? And how do you persuade people to take it? Its challenge was to make its matzah seem not only superior, but also traditional and religiously authentic. And the second challenge it had was to overcome what we've already seen was some significant rabbinic resistance to machine-made matzah. In other words, how did it manage to get the rabbis to agree that this was fine and that it could be used in place of the handmade, round, locally produced matzah that their grandparents had made? And let's take each of those in turn. The first issue, how do you make matzah superior and authentic? And the answer really was, to his mind, that was an advertising problem. And if you go back in old Jewish newspapers, he was a master at how to advertise Manischewitz matzah as in always superior to the competition. He described in one ad how his matzahs were made in a temple of kashrus, a palace of cleanliness, a gigantic structure of steel and glass overflowing with light, air, and sunshine. In other words, he argued that his matzah met not only the standards of kashrut, but also the highest American food and health standards. They were, so to speak, therapeutic. Indeed, in one ad I found, he boasted, no human hand touches these matzahs in their manufacture, as if that fact, rather than the very production of matzah by hand, reflected Judaism's highest precept. In other words, by appealing to modern American consumer values to sell a traditional food product, um, the company implied that if you purchased Manischewitz matzah, you could subscribe to the highest values both of Judaism, the temple of kashrus, and of America. And interestingly, when Manischewitz advertised in Hebrew or in Yiddish, realizing that those were more traditional, often more orthodox customers, it placed even higher emphasis not on the cleanliness and the sunshine, but on kashrus. Indeed, it calls its matzah the most kosher matzah in the world, stressing scrupulousness in all aspects of matzah making, as well as utter reliability. And many, many rabbis were invited to watch that matzah. It was endorsed by the Agudas Harabonim, the organization of fervently Orthodox rabbis, in those days European trained rabbis, led by Rabbi Eliezer Silver, who conveniently was the rabbi in Cincinnati. But Manischewitz also had a wide range of acquaintances in rabbinic circles, and he would invite them to come and watch as the matzah is produced and to attest to the very high standards of kashrut. Um, Manischewitz also in its early years did a very clever thing and marketed matzah as an elite product. If you have an old box of Manischewitz matzah, they'll be called fine matzahs. And indeed, they were sold in cigar-type boxes, not the way they are today, but ones that opened the other direction, and protected the contents and kind of projected, much as a cigar box does, an aura of affluence. This all gave the square matzah cachet. Manischewitz knew perfectly well that if you could give, if your matzah became the preferred matzah of rich and powerful Jews, then of course lots of other Jews would soon follow suit. And the strategy worked. By the 1920s, Manischewitz matzah claimed that it delivered about 80% of all of the matzah in America and Canada was Manischewitz matzah. So it really dominated the market in many places. But you still needed that rabbinic uh, that rabbinic haskama endorsement, and here I think Manischewitz had some advantages being in America. First of all, the majority of East European immigrants in the early period came to the United States from areas of Eastern Europe, notably Lithuania, where machine-made matzah had already won rabbinic sanction. And in any case, immigrants to America tended to favor accommodations to modernity. The folks who didn't like to accommodate to modernity, who chose tradition over modernity, they stayed in Europe. They didn't immigrate. So the people who ventured to the New World tended to be the kinds of people who were attracted to innovations of this kind. It's not unimportant that Hasidim come later to America. Hasidim who prefer handmade matzah and who oppose the machine. Uh, Many of them, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they come in the 1940s. Earlier, they were quite worried about America. So the fact that you had um, Lithuanian Jews, you didn't have too many rabbis in the first place, that made a difference. But the second is very interesting. Even some rabbis who opposed machine-made matzah in Europe favored machine-made matzah in the United States for a very simple and practical reason. They understood that if you didn't have this great machine of Manischewitz, there simply wouldn't be enough matzah for Jews to celebrate Passover. There weren't enough handmade matzah bakers. There weren't a huge body of poor people who would sit and do the baking. You suddenly had a community of millions of Jews, and the only way to provide sufficient matzah, rabbis understood, was by sanctioning the Manischewitz invention. Whereas in Eastern Europe, you had a long tradition of handmade matzah that some thought needed to be upheld. There was a sense that, just as in so many other ways, maybe America was different without that tradition. You had a practical reason for wanting to make Manischewitz matzah rather than see a great shortage of matzah at Passover time. I would say that Manischewitz went to great efforts to prove how punctilious he was. Um, he was forever inviting rabbis to come to his plant to see it. And he collected a long list of famous rabbis who supported his matzah. It's also interesting that the Manischewitz company maintained very close ties to the Yishuv, to the Jewish community in the land of Israel, and to its rabbis. Ber Manischewitz sent two of his children to study in Jerusalem. They both married there, so he was personally linked to families in Jerusalem, and he imported a mashgiach, a ritual supervisor from Israel to oversee the kashrut of Manischewitz. And finally, the family went so far as to establish a yeshiva uh, uh, in Jerusalem known as Rabbi Ber Manishewitz's yeshiva. And I've actually met people who remembered studying at Yeshivas Manischewitz in Jerusalem. Now, it's actually kind of interesting that they named the yeshiva after the funder, Yeshivas Manischewitz, because when you think of the early yeshivot in the land of Israel, they're not named for people. Eitz Chaim, the Tree of Life Yeshiva, or Porat Yosef Yeshiva. So why is Manischewitz Yeshiva different, named after someone? And if they were going to name it, why did they call it Manischewitz? Why not um, Rav Dov Ber's Yeshiva? And the answer, which we actually learned from a court case, is that they very much wanted that name Manischewitz because they wanted to have a group of rabbis who were associated with the name Manischewitz and who would essentially be ambassadors all over the world for the product, making clear that these matzahs are indeed fully kosher and acceptable. And they would be matzah missionaries, so to speak, emissaries, spreading the word of Manischewitz matzah north, south, east, and west. In other words, these rabbis trained in the land of Israel helped to legitimate and to promote this new Manischewitz product. They became part of its business strategy, um, a kind of effort to shape a matzah empire uh, that would extend from the borders of North America outward throughout the diaspora and to Palestine. And these graduates, through their piety and their charity and their commitment to learning, that would kind of pass from the students and would make the matzah as well respected and trusted and welcome. And I have to say, for a time, that strategy worked very well. Manischewitz was respected in Europe as the most kosher matzah of all. I know that personally because my own maternal grandmother in London, scion of a very distinguished Hasidic line, she preferred Manischewitz matzah over all other brands, even over the local English brands. And that's amazing because America had a reputation among Orthodox Jews as being somewhat lax in matters of religion. Haifa and Medina, an unkosher land, and yet Manischewitz matzah um, did not have that, but was indeed accepted. And more and more Jews, not only in North America, but increasingly in other countries as well, came in the first half of the 20th century to celebrate Pesach with machine made matzah from the Manischewitz company. Now, today, of course, the company is no longer an independent entity. It's no longer a part of a family business. There's a great conglomerate that makes other kinds of matzah today, um, from even bigger machines than Manischewitz had. And of course, machine-made matzah from Israel has also become a very significant factor in the matzah marketplace. Um, it's also very, very interesting how, with the coming of uh, Jews from areas of Europe that had rejected machine made matzah, we saw a tremendous resurgence of handmade matzah, especially for the Seder itself. And Chabad has played a huge role in spreading that and in making handmade matzah available. And that became both educationally significant and ritually significant, so that the matzah trade has changed, and shmura matzah, handmade matzah, has made a very dramatic comeback. And there have also been in recent years significant packaging improvements that allow handmade matzah from very far away to be distributed. Nevertheless, as we sit down to celebrate Pesach, the achievements of Manischewitz, it seems to me, should not be forgotten. Its transformation of matzah offers us a very unusual case study in the interrelationship of business and technology and charity and Yiddishkeit. Indeed, machine-made matzah is, in a sense, a triumph of the idea that modernity and tradition can be harmonized, that you can bring together newfangled machines and automated processes and harmonize them with the most traditional food that we have in our Jewish diet, the matzah. But you can do that as long as you pay very close attention, as the Manischewitzes certainly did, to technology, to marketing, and to the importance of gaining full rabbinic approval for their accomplishment. So, as they say, that's the rest of the story of Manischewitz, and I'm happy to wish all those listening a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a happy and kosher Passover.